Tony Blair, very warm welcome to eNews Channel Africa. Let me start with this, if I can. Your visit has been shrouded in controversy over Desmond Tutu's refusal to share a stage with you. Let me suggest that this does not sit comfortably with you.
Actually, I'm a little mystified by it, since we were never due to share a stage, in fact. But look, it's his decision. It's fine by me. But I've got a lot of things that I do now, and not least in Africa, where I have my charity, the Africa Governance Initiative, that works in many African countries, and I'm a passionate advocate for Africa. So I know we've got a disagreement over Iraq. We'll just have to leave that.
You must be disappointed, though, surely.
Look, when you end up 10 years as Prime Minister, you end up in situations, particularly after 9/11, where there are very controversial decisions that get taken. I'm afraid you have to take those decisions, and then you stand by them, and some people disagree. So it's fair enough.
The whole notion about saying that the Iraq strategy was morally indefensible, you would obviously disagree with that, but is that something that's going to define the Tony Blair legacy?
There's a disagreement. You know, I could produce for you many Iraqis who would say, remember the hundreds of thousands of people that died under Saddam, remember his use of chemical weapons against the Kurds, in which thousands in the town of Halabja were wiped out even in one day. We just had recently the memorial of the Iran-Iraq war. There were 1 million casualties. Many of those were young Iranian soldiers killed by chemical weapons. You know, you talk to the Marsh Arabs, you talk to the people who were persecuted. So they would give you a different perspective. And really what I would say is these decisions are incredibly difficult to make. And the best thing is not for someone to say, look, I'm morally superior to you because I take a different point of view, but just to understand they are difficult. Look, we've got a difficult decision on Iran today. Do you stop them getting a nuclear weapon, or do you let them? You know, what's the morally right position? Very tough. We have a situation in Syria where, let's be clear, I mean, in the last year now, probably 30,000 people have been killed, including many innocent civilians, women and children amongst them. Are we wrong to intervene or right to intervene? You know, what is the morally right answer? So I think the best thing is not to sort of judge each other personally on these types of decisions, but to realize that it's part of a healthy democracy where people can disagree. And you know, that's a disagreement I have. I admire very much the work that he did in fighting against apartheid, where he and I were on the same side. But on this, we're on a different one.
Do you think he's dropped the ball on this one?
No, I don't want to comment more on it, really.
All right, let me ask you this then. Let's come back to Iraq and the whole notion about the morality of the decision. As you've become more open in your faith since leaving office, do you sit back sometimes and question some of those decisions that you made 10 years ago?
I think you assess and constantly reassess decisions. And look, I came into government focused on my domestic agenda in 1997. I ended up fighting 4 different wars: Iraq, Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, where we intervened to prevent that country falling into the hands of gangsters, Kosovo, where there we were acting against a Christian country and preventing the ethnic cleansing of Muslims. So, you know, you realize when you become Prime Minister, or you're in a situation where there are these very difficult decisions, and you have to take them and do what you think is right, and that's the important thing. But, you know, there are many other things that I did in my time as Prime Minister, not least when we put Africa center stage at the Gleneagles G8 summit in 2005. We had this huge debt relief program, doubling of aid, and there's a lot of things where, you know, I will be on the same side as some of my friends on the more liberal left, if you like, but on this issue we obviously disagreed.
Given that you're at a leadership summit today, and you'll be talking a little bit later this afternoon, do you sometimes question your own leadership strategy at that time?
You should always question your own leadership and assess and reassess it constantly. But, you know, the trouble with leadership is when you're actually sitting in the chair, you have to take the decision. And, you know, everyone else can go, well, there's this point and there's that point. But when you're the leader, you have to take the decision. And when you become a leader, the essence of leadership is being prepared to take on that responsibility. And if you do, by the way, take that responsibility on, people will criticize you, and people will attack you, and people will say you're this and you're that, and you've got to keep your own mind as clear as you can, your own conscience as clear as you can, and taking decisions you believe may be right. Now, you may not be right, by the way, which is a problem, but you've got to do it on the basis of what you think is right.
And so, as you speak to me in 2012, your conscience remains clear, does it?
Well, I believe I took the right decision, but I'm you see, I've never disrespected people who thought that I made the wrong decision. What I always say to them is, don't disrespect me either. Understand there is another point of view here. And you know, when you see what is coming across the whole of the Middle East at the moment, where you've got these revolutions for democracy, but let's be absolutely clear, it's going to be, the work starts when you get rid of the old oppression. And we're finding this now in Egypt and in other countries where the tough decisions on the economy, on how you get different religious groups living and working together in peace and harmony, how you make sure that people understand democracy is a way of thinking, not just a way of voting, all of that remains to be done.
Yet the polarization seems to be more pronounced, more intense than it's ever been. Why is that?
I think it is in every regard, actually. I mean, so if you look at American politics today, for example, I don't think you've ever had a time where people have been more partisan. I have a theory about this, which is that part of the problem in the way that political parties work today and the media interacts with political parties is that the majority of people who actually want a quite rational, reasonable debate tend to get squeezed and pushed to the side because those that use the most inflammatory rhetoric, make the most extravagant claims, in a sense, they're the most newsworthy. And it's a problem, I'm afraid. I'm not sure what the answer to it is, but it is a problem. And what it means is that you've got a situation in Europe, and I think in America at the moment, obviously not fit to comment on South Africa, but where actually, if you're not careful, a lot of the rhetoric really gets in the way of practical solutions.
And the fact that 300 meters away from where we're sitting, a protest will gather a little later this afternoon, people who want to effect a citizen's arrest on you. How does that sit with you, and is that part of the rhetoric that you refer to?
Well, it is really part of the rhetoric. I mean, you know, I always say to these people, why don't you protest against the people doing the killing? I mean, the people who are driving car bombs into crowded street markets or blowing up facilities and doing that through terrorism, and for example, I'm afraid, in parts of Africa like Nigeria today, killing people in churches and so on. I mean, go and protest against them. I mean, I don't, so anyway, look, people are perfectly entitled to their own view about it. But, you know, one of the things you learn about politics, and I think, actually this is particularly true today, is if you're not prepared to take protests and demonstrations, don't go into this business. Because whatever you do, there's going to be someone out there who says it's an outrage and we disagree with you.
Tony Blair, let's move on, if we can, from the Middle East and perhaps to some of the other issues. You're at this leadership summit, as we've discussed. What, in your opinion, defines modern political leadership, but also business leadership in the current idiom? How's it changed since you left office?
Well, I think it has changed in this way. I think we live in an era of uniquely low predictability right now, where the consequences, normally as a politician, you try to take calculated risks. I mean, you try not to take risks, by the way, but if you take them, they've got to be calculated. I think the choices, for example, with the financial crisis, actually the choices in how we deal with some of the extremism in the world, those are choices with incalculable consequences. So they're very, very difficult. And I think that began when I was in office is even starker today. But the other thing that I think is really important about modern political leadership is what I call the focus on governance. And this is what fascinates me today. I learned so much as a Prime Minister in 10 years. And I learned in the end to distrust rhetoric and campaigns and all the rest of it, and to focus on practical policy making and getting solutions that really work. And that is my advice to political leaders today and also to business leaders.
Well, people stick it at you all the time. Why don't you stick it to South Africa? Here's your opportunity. Give us your assessment, and I understand from a distance, you don't live here, but give us your assessment of the country right now, particularly given that our president is under an enormous amount of pressure and accused of a failure of leadership on many different fronts.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, welcome to the...
to the real world.
Yeah, I mean, that's what all leaders all around the world are accused of right now. Look, South Africa has come an enormous way to escape the legacy of the past, and that is a fantastic achievement. But the truth is, now, what government is really about today, and this is not just about South Africa, it's about delivering infrastructure, education, law and order, and it's about practical programs that really work. And my point today...
And a lot of those programs aren't working.
Well, some are working, and some obviously you need to do a lot more on, but I mean, and I give this with great humility, but I think around the world today, there are examples of what works and what doesn't. But what you notice about nearly all of those examples, whether in health policy, education, law and order, infrastructure, is they rely less on ideology and far more on what I would call innovative, creative solutions. And I think, you know, one of the things that I advise leaders today to do is you know, whatever political campaigning and rhetoric is, understand that world, and you've got to live in that world because you're a politician. But actually, what I learned in my last years in office, where I was actually in many ways a far more effective prime minister on the domestic policy agenda, was to focus on clear, practical programs of reform that made a difference. And when you look around the world, in areas like law and order and education, for example, you can see what works. There's very clear examples of it.
Are we still living up to the ideals of Nelson Mandela, do you think?
Well, you are in many ways, and sometimes what happens, by the way, is that inside a country you don't notice the differences and the improvements. You simply focus on the things still to be done. But, you know, South Africa has a completely different feel today. In many ways, that's a huge positive. You know, you remember when you had the World Cup and everything, and everyone said, oh, it's never going to work, it's all going to be a disaster. It was fantastic. Now, I just think what you've got is a challenge that is about the same problems most countries have, but you have this additional legacy of the past that still creates enormous problems, particularly with young numbers of unemployed, young black people and so on, jobs. But my, you know, again, as I say, I'd say this with great humility, but my advice is focus on practical solutions. There's no great ideological solution that will work in today's world, but the countries that have succeeded have focused, prioritized, and implemented programs of change that have been evidence-based and usually have involved, by the way, partnership between public and private sector.
Read any newspaper, as far as Tony Blair's future is concerned, you're either replacing Kofi Annan as the special envoy to Syria, or you're making a return to frontline British politics. Which is it?
Neither, I should think. No, I want to intervene more in both the debates back home, but also in the European debate, which is the critical thing we're all facing. And, you know, I've got a lot of energy and ideas, and if people want to listen, that's fine. And if they don't, that's fine. But no, I think it's unlikely I'm going to find myself back in a frontline political position, but, you know, you never know.
Tony Blair, thank you.
Thank you.